Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar in collaboration with the Global CCS Institute on an overview of the 2024 Global Status of CCS report. My name is Crystal Stabell, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about this webinar. This webinar is going to be in support of USEA's program that focuses on CCUS and clean fossil energy technologies, which we support through briefings, workshops, reports, and webinars like the one we're hosting today. A little bit about the logistics. This webinar is going to be recorded, and we will post it on our website on USEA. Feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A box below, and we'll address your questions and comments at the end. Today, we are going to be speaking with Jarad Daniels, the CEO of Global CCS Institute. But first, we'll have the Honorable Mark Menezes, the CEO and President of the U.S. Energy Association, making his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Crystal. It's a pleasure to be here today. And just to follow up with Crystal's introductory remarks, let me just tell you a little bit about USEA. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution. We were founded in 1924 as a U.S. member of the World Energy Council. And today we convene and conduct forums and workshops for the public, our members, and energy stakeholders. And we sponsor the types of studies and reports that you'll be hearing about today. So if you'd like to learn more about us, you can visit us at usea.org. And on today's topic, let me say at the upfront that it pleases me to be rejoining with Jarad Daniels, who I first got to know while at the Department of Energy. And as we at the Department of Energy during the first Trump administration, and we were very much looking at technologies to help deploy that really focused on reducing, our emissions. As you might recall, as is today, that Trump administration, really supports all of the above energy sources. And so it's important to have all energy sources to meet the increasing demand, whether it's from data centers or, the increase in our economies, both domestically and globally. And so, the key that we felt back then was really to focus on how it is that we can reduce emissions. Well, the answer to probably everybody on this call, and certainly I think, with Jarad and Jarad's group of the Global CCS Institute is, if you want to address the consequences of climate change, you have to look to reduce emissions. And what not a better way to put carbon capture on point source, direct air capture, and ambient, air, all toward reducing emissions. And that's really, it seems to be self-evident. Policies supporting CCS and CCUS, DAC, have generally received bipartisan support. And we have seen Congress, enact the 45Q provisions, and we have seen both in the IIJA and the IRA, efforts to really foster the development of carbon capture, sequestration, and direct air capture. And you will hear from Jarad really the great and tremendous progress, that has been made not only here in the United States, but also globally. And so since this is something that I personally have been involved in. I recall in 2018, maybe taking a trip to Carbon Engineering, that the facility outside of Vancouver that later has been purchased by Occidental and now part of the Occidental projects, really to see the exciting, technology deployment that can be put to use in the direct air capture. So really excited about this, happy to be a part of it, enthusiastic to work with Jarad and his organization. And again, I want to personally thank all of you on this call for your interest in this really important topic. And so with that, Jarad, I will turn it over to you. And thank you once again for working with USEA on this very important topic.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark, and always a pleasure to work with you. And thank you for those opening remarks. It really sets the stage, I think, for the presentation and the discussion that I'll provide today of what's the appropriate role of carbon capture, utilization, and storage alongside every other energy technology we need to service our growing, energy demands globally, and do that in an environmentally responsible way, including, a carbon footprint. And so that's really, the greatest framing overall in terms of what is that appropriate role of CCUS alongside all of the other technology choices we have to make that work from an integrated system perspective. And so let me share some slides with you here and dive into a presentation. Hopefully we'll have enough time at the end to have some good Q&A. That's really where all the fun usually is. But again, this is based on the work that we do in the Global CCS Institute, tracking the progress of the deployment of carbon capture in storage technologies on a global basis. And so, at the stage, right? I mean, we're witnessing a large increase in activity, policy-driven activity, spurred by strong policy movement in the last several years on a global basis. And as Mark mentioned, a lot of that was here in the United States, which historically has been one of the leading countries to advance all forms of energy technologies, including, fossil energy combined with carbon capture and storage for many decades. And so this map shows, and these numbers show, where CCS is at today on a global basis. This is updated from last month of our data set that tracks all the global projects. You can see that a large number of those are centered here in the United States. You can see North America has a number of dots on the map, plenty of projects being developed in Europe as well. You can see a cluster around the Middle East, strong activity now at scale in China, and activity in Southeast Asia and around Australia as well. And so our current count is that there are 65 operational CCS projects up and running in the world, with a combined capture capacity of 57 million ton per annum. Right, this is a large-scale operation. Many of these projects have been operating well for a decade or decades. Under construction, right, post a positive financial investment decision, there's another 40 plus projects in that category that will add, when they finish construction and start to operate, an additional 44 million ton per annum. So all in, if you add up the operational and those under construction that soon will start operating, that gets you to a little bit over 100 million ton per annum, 0.1 gigaton, if you think of this in gigaton scale. If you look at the entire project pipeline, including projects that have been announced and are various phases of early and advanced development, those total in number to about 700 and bring the total cumulative capture capacity up to 450 million ton per annum, or 0.45 gigaton. So great progress since we've been doing this for a long time, but there's still a ways to go. Most of the integrated modeling suggests the appropriate role of CCS alongside everything else we need to do if we're trying to get to a climate stabilized future is on the gigaton scale, gigatons of point source capture and gigatons of the carbon dioxide removal, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So just from context there. On this chart, you can really see what that pipeline looks like. Again, the dark blue at the bottom are the operational projects. The turquoise color are the ones in construction, and you can see that doubling of projects from where we were 4 or 5 years ago. Much of this has been inspired by strong supportive policy that makes CCS investable, which is certainly a requirement, in addition to durable, regulatory regimes and environments. And you can sort of see this exponential curve in the projects in various early and advanced stages of development. We certainly hope this will continue. I expect this will continue on a global basis. There are more and more countries leaning forward to support and accelerate deployment of CCS. So when you look at, sort of that global basis, CCS, as you saw on that map, is already deploying in some regions, but there were clearly spots on the map where CCS is slow or really hasn't even begun. And so, one of the roles of the CCS Institute, and for many of my colleagues in the broader carbon management community on a global basis, is how do we share those lessons? How can we work together to share that knowledge built from decades of R&D, built from many years of operational lessons learned from projects, and how do we speed that curve and shorten that development time frame for all the other places that need as much help as they can get to advance and accelerate this deployment to help decarbonize their energy system, their industrial systems. There's near-term opportunities in a number of regions. We've seen strong interest in Latin America, specifically in Brazil and Mexico. Interesting interest in direct air capture, actually in Africa, and some other interest in CCS there. Strong project development, large-scale project development in the Middle East, and strong interest in project development in Asia as well. I think there's increasing attention to CCS and carbon management under the UNFCCC, global policy conversations. We're seeing CCS explicitly contained in more countries' nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and there's some global collaboration efforts and platforms that are moving forward, such as the Carbon Management Challenge, that are indicative of strong and growing broad government interest and ambition to deploy CCS moving forward. But again, at the end of the day, you need strong government policy frameworks, clearly a role for strong government leadership, and you need funding and financial mechanisms that make CCS investable. If this is going to scale, it has to be done on fair, commercial terms. And so that's really, the heart of the conversation of what's it going to take? What do governments need to do to make that investable? What does the private sector need to do to lean forward and get these projects designed, built, up and running? In terms of just the application of CCS, one of its strengths is its broad ability to decarbonize a number of carbon intensive industries. And so just as examples in some of the low carbon fuel space, whether it's ethanol or hydrogen production, the Decatur project, that was a DOE project, started up in 2017, capturing from the US's largest ethanol facility in Decatur, Illinois. Shell has their Quest project started up over a decade ago up in Canada, capturing from a hydrogen production facility up there. If you look at carbon intensive industries, cement and steel, commodities that we need for modern life, they have a carbon footprint. And so, CCS is one of the technologies to deeply decarbonize those processes that we simply can't live without, but we want to greatly reduce their carbon footprint. Al Rayada in the UAE started up in 2016, capturing on the order of 1 million metric tons there. And the Brevik plant that is under construction now in Europe, part of an integrated project I'll get to in a bit. In the power sector, again, we have plenty of choices in terms of putting electrons on the grid. We need that to be firm and resilient and reliable, and that's fossil energy with CCS as some part of that overall mix. It depends on where you are, which country, what other options you have, but we've seen progress, carbon capture and storage on stationary power plants. The Boundary Dam coal-fired project started up in 2014 up in Canada. Net zero Teesside CCS on a gas combined cycle is now under construction or being developed in Europe. And again, strong interest, as Mark said earlier. What do we need to put CCS on gas combined cycle here to help support the growing power demand needs for some of our data centers and hyperscalers that look to dramatically increase the electricity demand here in the States in the near term and in the midterm. And then, as he also mentioned, the role of direct air capture to pull CO2 out of the air. There's a number of projects that are up and running at small scale, and Mark mentioned one he visited that Occidental Petroleum and Carbon Engineering are putting forward with their technology, 500,000 ton scale that's moving forward as well. So broad application, and it's exciting to see a lot of these projects going forward. This chart just sort of gives you a little bit of the history and lets you see, just by number of circles here, the number of projects that we're tracking in the various phases. One thing to note, if you look at the bottom left, this started in 1972. We've been capturing CO2 for enhanced oil recovery here for over 50 years in the United States, have a pipeline network and infrastructure already built out, thousands of miles of CO2 pipeline here that operate wonderfully well year in and year out. But you can see as we move forward in time to the right of this slide, the growing diversity of application on power generation, on growing bit on hydrogen and ammonia fertilizer. I think on the left side, a lot of this started out on the more concentrated sources, or where you need to pull CO2 out of streams, like on natural gas processing or on fertilizer production, ammonia production. And as you move toward the right, toward current day, you can see more projects applying CCS on ethanol facilities and on cement facilities and in steel facilities. Pulp and paper is an interesting one that we see progress on going forward. Power gen, both on coal and gas, strong interest, and then the direct air capture at the top as well. And the bottom category here is, the number of projects just progressing the transport and storage component. Now, it doesn't matter where you capture the CO2, you need to transport and durably store it away from the atmosphere. And there's a number of business entities looking at that as a business opportunity and model as we move forward. As I mentioned earlier, CCS is also explicitly in the global climate conversation. The first global stock take that aimed to guide and enhance climate action country by country. There's text in there that explicitly says, it aims to accelerate CCUS, particularly in the carbon intensive sectors, steel and cement, chemicals, where we simply have no other technology choice to deeply decarbonize those technology sectors. In the nationally determined contributions, right, that describe country efforts to reduce their own emissions given their own national circumstances, we're seeing a growing number of those that explicitly include CCS. The third round of these NDCs were due, I think, at the end of last month in February of 2025. Those are still coming in, but you can see several additional countries have added CCS explicitly, and we're up to over 30 countries that have CCS explicitly in their country roadmaps, if you will, of how they're going to meet their ambitious climate targets as we all move forward. As I mentioned earlier, and as Mark said in some of his framing, it's all about how do you have a business model that's financeable to allow these projects to be built, owned, and operated on fair commercial terms, right? And so, as with many advanced technologies, right, long-term, durable government support at the front end is usually what we see, whether it's government R&D, whether it's investment in infrastructure, whether it's providing that durable regulatory and policy landscape for which investments can be decided and actually occur. Clearly a role of government there to provide that, clarity in long-term business environment. Clear and efficient permitting and approval of permitting required all across that value chain is extremely important as well. Another aspect are the long-term liabilities and assurances associated with durable geologic carbon storage. And so, these are all required to de-risk investment in CCS, and we're seeing progress in this in a number of jurisdictions in a number of different ways, country by country, region by region. There are some things over the last several years that are hampering investment in, all major capital intensive projects. We're in a relatively, inflationary period in history. And so that cost inflation is causing challenges for business models. Things that were in the money several years ago due to inflation, if they're capital intensive, may not look as attractive now to investors. And that's a concern. We're in high interest rate environment still, and so that weighs on business models, of course, as well. In some jurisdictions, there are permitting challenges, right? The time value of money, the uncertainty of how long is it going to take to get all of the permits required for a major project or a major infrastructure investment is of concern to many project developers as well. And in some jurisdictions around the world, there is now political uncertainty of what that policy landscape is going to look like. That is causing some pause as well, and some of the momentum that we've really seen and that my earlier slide showed in terms of this growing interest and momentum to drive these project developments forward. But on the other side of the coin, perhaps, there's potential tailwinds that we see as well. I already mentioned the need for reliable baseload power. If you look at, the forecast electricity demand here in the United States, many expect that to increase dramatically compared to what it was over the last couple of decades, driven primarily by the energy demands, the electricity demands for these large data centers, the hyperscalers that need firm, reliable, low carbon power for those facilities. That has spurred keen interest in natural gas combined cycle with CCS as the technology choice that pencils out as the economic choice of most interest to provide the electrons, the decarbonized electrons for those facilities. So a key opportunity here in the United States, for example, but in other regions of the world as well. And there's a demand for high quality carbon credits and carbon removal credits. We saw that start with some of the direct air capture facilities that we already spoke about. This is evolving to the bioenergy integrated with carbon capture and storage projects that are of interest and being progressed globally as well. And so that's a potential tailwind for some of this moving forward. We're seeing some increase in multilateral development bank interest in CCS, which could be critical to help accelerate deployment in the developing realm in those areas of the map where you don't see a lot of projects currently. But all of the global analysis says as they grow their energy systems, they're going to need firm decarbonized power as well. They're going to need to decarbonize their industrial sector emissions as well moving forward. And it's interesting to see some of the motion we've seen in equity investments, some mergers and acquisitions in this space, a little bit of movement toward debt financing for some CCS projects now. Again, business models that are replicable that can help accelerate progress as we all move forward is some tailwinds just to mention at the offset. So like any technology, right, we always want to improve the performance of the technology, drive down the cost. CCS, one of the largest cost centers there, maybe 75 or 80% of an overall value chain is in the capture component. It's capital intensive, it's energy intensive. And so these are some of the things that you can look at that drive what that capital cost is, right? The CO2 partial pressure or the concentration of CO2 in the working fluid or in the gas stream that you're trying to pull the CO2 out of, that's a driver of capital costs. The more concentrated the CO2, usually the lower the cost, all things being equal. The technology selection, there's a number of technologies that have been in various stages of R&D and development over decades. They each have their own applicability to a variety of point sources for removing CO2. The technology selection you choose has obviously an impact on your capture costs. Energy costs, some of these technologies are very energy intensive. And so, the cost of your underlying energy supply, whether it's heat or whether it's electricity, is an impact of what's your total system cost for CCS on a dollar per ton basis, if you will. And then, of course, the location, right, of, what's your cost of labor, what's your cost of materials, how far are you, how long of a pipeline might you need to build to move that CO2 from where you capture it to where you want to durably store it away from the atmosphere. All of those things go into, the figure of what is your overall project cost going to look like. Capture fraction, how much of that CO2 you capture also has an impact on the overall cost and on your equipment choices. There is certainly economy of scale in most things at industrial scale. CCS is no different. So that plant size and scale and how you can get those economies, whether it's a hub and cluster approach or whether it's modularization, those are factors that drive cost as well. How pure your CO2 stream is and how much upfront treatment you may need to remove impurities so they don't hamper your carbon capture system. That's something that needs to be considered when you're looking at your overall system cost. And then finally, if this is a retrofit to an existing facility or a totally fully integrated new build where you can really integrate that heat and mass balance and make your integrated process as efficient as possible, that also has a bearing on what your overall system cost or your per unit cost is. So, just drilling into this and just to give you a couple of examples, the chart on the right is, what partial pressure, really determines the size of the process equipment, right? How much flow do you need through your process vessels? How large do those vessels have to be from a capital cost basis? And as you can see, usually as you move up to higher concentrations, higher partial pressures, the costs come down, all things, other things being equal in your overall system. If you look at, the graph on the right in terms of capture fraction, over the last couple of decades, a capture of 90% capture used to be a benchmark. That's certainly not a technical limitation. It turns out most early techno-economic studies were conducted at 90% just as a baseline for convenience. So to compare apples to apples across various design studies and techno-economic studies. DOE's National Energy Technology Lab Systems Analysis Group was really at the core of this well over a decade ago, setting a standard for publicly available analysis that many others followed. The community has moved on since then. I think 95% capture is more the norm today. Everyone realized systems can capture well better than 90%. And again, up until about 97%, where the marginal costs sort of start to go up, as you can see on this chart to the right, you reach diminishing returns for amine-based solvent technology at some point. But in that 95% capture realm or so, you can see that's a nice spot to operate on. In that a lot of the projects that we see are being scaled to that capture rate now. In terms of trends that we see, and these are just in real terms, because technologies continue to improve, the efficiency of the solvents or the sorbents or the membranes continue to improve by R&D and learning by doing. You can see this, sort of the what's conveyed on these charts of the cost per unit, right, on a dollar per ton basis, is improving as we move on through time. Right, and so there's some thermodynamic limits. We're not there yet in terms of the energy demand on a per ton basis, but you can just see this trend. These are some examples of some studies on both coal-fired power generation and gas-fired power generation for amine-based solvents. But again, this just is indicative of some of the progress and the trends we see, and we would expect to continue in addition to the learning by doing. When you take a step back and you say, what are the costs? There is no one size fits all cost for CCS. It depends on your application. It depends on where you are. It depends on if it's a retrofit, what the rest of your existing facility looks like. This is just to show you a graph of some work done by the European Commission's Joint Research Center. They studied a lot of peer-reviewed journal literature over this last year. And you can just see here that if you look at some of the concentrated CO2 streams, natural gas processing, ammonia production, those are on the low cost end, on the order of maybe $20 per ton or so. The graph on the left, in all these graphs, actually, the boxes are the upper quartile and the lower quartile in terms of all the literature data. You can see sort of the average, trend line and the mean value shown with an X. But if it's a higher concentration source, your capture costs are in that maybe €20 per ton kind of realm, $20 per ton realm. When you have more dilute CO2 streams, whether it's from iron and steel or cement or pulp and paper, those costs are higher. And so again, not a one size fits all cost, but you can see the relative order here. You can compare that with the chart on the top right, pulling CO2 from the air where it's a little over 400 so parts per million. That's a more dilute CO2 basis, and so the costs of capture are higher in the hundreds of dollars per ton realm. That's still a relatively new technology, immature technology compared to the higher concentration point sources where those technologies have been around for many, many decades. And so we would expect perhaps stronger improvement in cost of capture declines moving forward through advances in technology from capture from the atmosphere. But you can see sort of with this diagram here where these costs are today for both the direct air capture approaches and the bio-based bioenergy with CCS approaches. And then on the bottom right, once you have your capture, you then need to compress the CO2 to pipeline spec pressure, 1200, 2200, PSI perhaps. That adds cost, as you can see in the bar on the left. And then, how you're going to transport it. Here in the States, we do this through a network of pipelines. In other regions, in the North Sea, by Europe, across Southeast Asia, they're looking at shipping CO2 as a commodity because from a total integrated system perspective, capturing from point sources and shipping it to where you have good storage geology at a low per unit cost seems to be the most advantageous model to follow. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of where the costs are. And again, the take-home message is there is no one cost. It really depends. There's, of course, strategies for continuing to reduce those costs through R&D, through learning by doing, through a number of mechanisms. We already mentioned the economy of scale. There's a number of projects we're tracking, well over 100 CCS hubs and networks, hubs and clusters, where you can capture from a large number of point sources, use shared common infrastructure to move the CO2 from your point sources to your stores. That has tremendous value, lowering that per unit cost. Technology will continue to improve. Newer, better, more efficient solvents, sorbents, membranes, capture processes, process optimization will continue to improve. Modularity, how do you get economy of scale through, modularization is an interesting approach that some technology providers and project developers are pursuing. As I mentioned, the more you can integrate your heat balance into the rest of your overall system you're trying to decarbonize, that always brings efficiencies, both from an engineering perspective and from an economic or a cost perspective. And that's something that many people are working for. Easier on a new build than a retrofit. Um, there's going to be learning by doing as well as you move from first of a kind to nth of a kind costs. And so we're starting to see some of that play out, capture on ethanol facilities as one example, perhaps. And then I think, all of this moves into, improved financing terms. Financiers do not like low serial numbers, right? So the more we move toward that nth of a kind, the more we can de-risk some of the perceptions of carbon capture and storage in the financial community from the insurers and reinsurers. All of that goes toward, lower cost of capital, improved financing, which can help move these into the investable category. Overall, everybody wins as all those projects move forward and we share those learnings. So again, getting together and taking a step back, the more we collaborate as a global CCS community, that's going to be better for everyone. There's a number of international collaboration platforms, Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, that it's more government-centric. Carbon Management Challenge is a new entity along those same lines. METI in Japan, the government has really done wonders to stand up this Asia CCUS network over the last several years, public-private collaboration to advance CCS conversations in Southeast Asia. We at the Institute have been tracking over 50 bilateral agreements or MOUs between, two governments that have been executed in the last 5 years of how they're going to move CO2 across sovereign national borders. That portends to be the low-cost option for CO2 emissions through CCS in those jurisdictions. We're also tracking a number of public-private partnerships. Just to highlight a few on the right side of this slide here, in Norway, the Norwegian government's been a champion of CCS for many decades, one of the strongest bilateral partners of the US in this technology space. They've championed the Longship project. It's a cross-border open access CO2 transport and storage project. Their first customers, Yara plant and Brevik's a cement plant that Heidelberg runs in Norway. These will be the first point sources to capture the CO2 as part of this integrated value chain. The CO2 receiving facility for what they call the Northern Lights part of the project was completed in September of last year. The first CO2 tanker titled the Northern Pioneer. It's the world's first commercial liquefied CO2 transport ship. That was delivered last month in February, capable of carrying 8,000 tons of CO2 per trip. So a lot of progress there. Another project to highlight in the Netherlands, the Porthos project, started construction about a year ago, thanks to 3 state-owned enterprises, Gasunie, the Port of Rotterdam, and EBM, that were underwriting the transport and storage costs. The Dutch government is providing a contract for difference mechanism that helps get this to financial investability. And starting from next year, it's anticipated this project will store on the order of 2.5 million ton per annum, total capacity of around 37 million ton. In Saudi Arabia, a different governance model, but the energy minister has signed a joint development agreement with Saudi Aramco, SLB, and Linde to establish a CCUS hub in Jubail. The first phase of that hub has a capacity to store up to 9 million ton per annum, and that should be, up and startup shakedown 2027, operational soon thereafter. That's the first step at 9 million ton per annum. The second phase, 44 million ton per annum by 2035 is the current plan and trajectory. And again, that gives you just one idea of the the scale you can achieve with some of these integrated CCS hubs and clusters. There's some other projects here. The Shepherd project in Southeast Asia, a combined effort with Malaysia and South Korean governments and a number of private sector entities there as well, as you can see. And here in the States, the US Department of Energy initiated development of 2 direct air capture hubs. One is listed here, a capacity of 1 million ton per annum. This hub in Louisiana is being developed by Climeworks Corporation, Heirloom Carbon Technologies, and geologic storage services provided by Gulf Coast Sequestration. So a lot of examples of really collaborative efforts on a number of these large integrated projects. The Carbon Management Challenge, just to quickly highlight, this is a relatively new effort, stood up 22 countries plus the European Commission. This is aligned with getting carbon management, carbon capture and storage from point sources, carbon dioxide removal from the air, to the gigaton scale that a lot of the modeling and analysis say is the appropriate role of CCS alongside every other technology out there. Getting there as quickly as we can. The models suggest 2030, that's the scale that we need to be at. There's 3 work streams to collaborate moving forward. How do we, spur and accelerate financing for CCS projects in the developing realm? How do we track our progress getting toward that gigaton of scale? And then, how do we work together as a community for strategic outreach and engagement? And so this is an effort the Global Institute is helping to service this moving forward. And again, you can see a large number of countries across all of the regions of the globe are engaged in this challenge. Some organizations that have been around for longer amounts of time, the Clean Energy Ministerial, this is a group of 26 countries, all the G20 members except Argentina and Turkey. They form a unique collaborative model to accelerate clean energy development broadly. There's a CCUS initiative here that the US helped initiate a number of years ago, 16 countries working together, collaborating with carbon intensive industries that know they need CCS to decarbonize, working with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, working with the Global Concrete and Cement Association, working with the IEA, the International Energy Agency. Mission Innovation, more focused on the carbon dioxide removal technologies. But again, all of these mechanisms working together as a community to collaborate globally to speed the curve on these technologies, again, consistent with all the math that says this is what we need to do. Another one, just to highlight more on the technical community end, the IEA's greenhouse gas technology collaboration platform, or the IEA GHG. This was established in 1991, 39 member countries and organizations working together to advance the understanding of these technologies, published over 400 technical reports, those on the order of a dozen or 15 per year. An international network of experts are facilitated by this organization. Every other year, they put on the community's seminal conference, the International Greenhouse Gas Technology Conference. The last one was hosted up in Calgary in October. Over 1,500 of the world's leading CCS experts, technical experts, were part of that conversation there. So really, really great seminal work, supporting the next generation of folks that are going to come and actually get this to grow and scale globally. As the IEA GHG has their international summer schools with well over 700 alumni now. They're up to their 16th summer school that'll be hosted this year up in Canada at the International CCS Knowledge Center. So just a shout out there. Again, this takes a lot of work to move all these things forward. Really quickly, I want to just go right around the world in terms of sort of where CCS is. Here in the States, we've been doing this a long time, 26 operational projects, 11 more in construction. There's a number of policies in place that make CCS investable here, durable policy landscape. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA's regulations for CO2 injection, Class 6 under the Underground Injection Control Program, those were finalized in December of 2010. They've been around, durable policy. There's been a lot of enabling policy, 45Q tax credits, strong bipartisan support since those tax credits were enacted first in 2008. They were strengthened under both the Democratic and Republican presidencies in the last decade. The Inflation Reduction Act greatly increased those and strengthened those as well. And you've seen progress in the number of projects leaning forward because of that. A variety of subnational policies actually exist as well here in the States that are helpful for these projects to be developed. What I already mentioned, right? This opportunity for CCS on natural gas combined cycle, a market-based opportunity to provide decarbonized electrons to the hyperscalers, the data centers. There's a number of large corporates, ExxonMobil, Baker Hughes and Frontier, Chevron, that have announced plans to invest in this moving forward here because of that market opportunity in the States. And there are others. Oh, sorry about that. Is well working on that. Calpine, one of our leading utility companies, has several projects that are moving forward as well in this space. And if you look as a figure of merit, the number of injection permits for these Class 6 injection wells, over 54 projects with 165 applications to the federal EPA now across 14 states. For the states that already have primacy or been delegated that authority, there's a large number of projects as well. Wyoming, Louisiana, North Dakota have primacy. West Virginia recently approved that and received that as well. So in the states, a lot of action here moving forward. If I stay in the Americas region, in Canada, there's 7 operational facilities. There's another 6 under construction. They have tax credits that look similar to ours. There's a Canada Growth Fund that has a fairly flexible model to provide additional financial support to advanced technology projects, including CCS and low carbon hydrogen. So strong progress there, direct investment in infrastructure in the province of Alberta. In Brazil, in Latin America, they passed a law last year in October that requires development of CCS-specific legislation. I have a colleague there in Sao Paulo today talking to regulators and stakeholders. Again, strong progress in Brazil. Petrobras, the national company, also has a project that's been operating extremely well, injecting over 10 million ton per annum. So strong technical experience and expertise in Brazil as well. If I look in Asia Pacific, 3 operating projects, 2 additional facilities under construction, standalone legislation in a number of countries, as you can see, that is enabling for CCS projects to move forward. We've been helpful for some of those, but it's really nice to see that legislation, a large, sort of first step to move forward for CCS project development. It's interesting to look at the amount of transboundary transport and storage analysis and conversation occurring in Southeast Asia, capture from a number of point source in developing countries, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, transport and storage to where the geologies and storage opportunities are tremendously good. Timor-Leste, Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia. A lot of this requires bilateral, multilateral conversation. Those conversations are occurring. Those systems analysis are occurring. In India, we've seen forward progress and interest in CCS and carbon management in India as well. They recently stood up 4 task forces to help progress the policy conversations for what it takes to deploy CCS in India as a sovereign country. In Europe and the UK, we've really seen a strong accelerated progress there in terms of interest in project development. 9 operational CCS facilities, another 13 in construction. A variety of policy tools at a European Commission level and a sovereign state level. The Net Zero Industry Act looks to force 30 million metric ton per annum of transport in storage by 2030. That's progressing well. 10 countries, in addition to the EU work, have introduced or announced roadmaps and strategies to help decarbonize their carbon-intensive industry and provide carbon management support. That's nice to see. And the number of facilities being developed for transport and storage of CO2 has really surged, reaching 84. It's really a doubling in the last year or two in terms of the amount of work going on for that in the European region. Longship that I mentioned is, again, just another great example of countries working together, public-private collaboration here. You can see just this on this map, where the capture is going to be, transport by ship to a receiving terminal, storage in, Norwegian waters under the North Sea. Lots of bilateral conversations, commercial agreements signed, really, really a world-class leading project moving forward there in a wonderful way that we all can learn and benefit from. In China, China's been moving forward for CCS at a pace and scale and speed that, really only China can at large large project level. CCS is prominent in their policies of how they're going to lower their carbon footprint. NDRC last summer released plans to reduce emissions of their existing coal-fired power plants, including CCS as one of those technologies. The central government is leading international collaboration with a number of countries, some explicitly, some a little bit more quietly. But really, the take-home message for China is they're starting to scale up projects at the million ton per annum, megaton per annum scale on a number of point sources. They have the world's largest CCS project operating in the cement industry, oxy-fuel project, 200,000 ton per annum. I visited it, talked to their project engineers a while ago. The large utility companies in China, China Energy, the world's largest power company, China Huanong, the second largest utility company in the world, have projects that they're either operating or about to stand up and operate at scale. Huanong, 1.5 million ton per annum capture, their own, own house developed technology, amine-based carbon capture technology, extremely efficient, fully integrated from day one, brand new design. 1.5 million ton per annum. This project is essentially done with construction, will be up and running in a few months. It'll be the world's largest capture on a coal facility at tremendously high efficiencies and low costs of capture on a per ton basis. So just some examples of significant progress in China and CCS. In the Middle East, and I apologize for the movement in the slides here, pre-operating projects, including first mover in the steel industry and in some petrochemical facilities, 6 more in construction. A lot of policy moving forward in terms of what's the role of markets to support investability of CCS. How are you going to work to have transboundary movement of and cross-border projects across a value chain with CCUS hubs and networks? And then notable developments in the continent of Africa as well. Growing interest really we've just seen pick up over the last couple of years in a number of countries there. So hopefully this whirlwind in the last few slides has given you an opportunity to realize there's a lot going on to progress CCS at a policy level, at a project level, globally in many regions, still a lot more work to do. One of the things that the Institute does is foster that knowledge sharing. Here's just some examples of some reports, whether it's on the advancements in technology we see in the cost curves, whether it's on how CCS is included in countries' nationally determined contributions and NDCs. We have sort of meta-analysis and survey studies on that. We worked with the Global Cement and Concrete Association, the Clean Energy Ministerial, to take a look at what's it take to put CCUS on cement plants in India to help support conversations there. That's publicly available on our website. And then a nice broad review is another example of the policy, the legal regulatory developments we've seen in developed and developing regions. There's a lot of lessons to be learned and share. That's part of what the Institute does as well. We also have convenings. We just had one last week in Europe, well attended, hundreds of folks. Our Americas Forum is coming up in a few weeks here in Washington, D.C. In other regions, we'll have these convenings as well. We've got active offices in a number of regions that are the basis of what I just showed you. But if we can be useful as a resource to you to understand state of development, please consider us a good source of that information. We have growing activity in Southeast Asia. We see a lot of growing activity. We want to be supportive of that going forward. And again, trying to provide that thought leadership of the critical path issues, that's always something that we want to do. Looking ahead, my view is, the outlook for CCS is positive. Yes, there's a tremendous amount of things that we still need to work on together, but we see a large number of governments leaning forward, putting that durable policy out there, putting some of the supports to spur project development. I think that's going to continue, and it's really exciting to see. Of course, there's challenges, community concerns, regulatory barriers. We're all in this together, and so we're all going to need to continue to work on that. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, but there's a number of flexible tools out there and approaches that are proving positive that we can do this. Collaboration is the key. And so I think, that's an invitation to all of you. Please lean in, please, if we can be, a partner to you to advance this, that's what we'd like to do. So with that, maybe I'll stop sharing and, would love to open it up in terms of any conversations, questions you might have. And again, really appreciate you listening to me here for this overview. Crystal.
Thank you for the presentation, Jarad. We've got many questions here, and we'll try to address as many as we can.
Sure.
This one here from, I'm going to butcher this, Jyotsna Sharma. Is there a need to broaden the conversation to all greenhouse gases, pollutants, VOCs, rather than solely focusing on CO2?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, at the end of the day, it is an all of the above solution, right? It's what Mark Menzies said at the beginning. We need all of these technologies to get from where we are to where we want to be. Efficiency does a wonderful thing, right? As much renewables, as much nuclear, as much wind and solar, right? There are some things where CCS is the only technology choice to decarbonize a cement plant, for example. Even if you ran it by 100%, clean electricity, you still have process emissions. CCS is the only technology. To answer your question, yes, we should be concerned about reducing other greenhouse gas, emissions. Methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. There's tremendous work in progress to reduce methane emissions. Much more work needs to continue there. That is economically attractive in a number of ways because we could actually harness and use that methane for good. But reducing the other, fluorocarbons and others, yes, absolutely. All of those things should be pursued in parallel because we're going to need all of this to help reach our combined goals. There is, again, not a silver bullet out there. We need as much of all of this in parallel to get to where we need to go.
Thank you. The next one we have here is from Sue Doward. For storage, what percentage of projects are doing EOR as opposed to geological storage? Do you see any movement away from EOR and towards geologic storage?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, on that slide that I showed at the front end, starting in 1972, a lot of this started with enhanced oil recovery. That was a business model that worked and was investable even before the world was really, concerned about climate change and, things of this nature. And so we do see, as all the data we're tracking, these hundreds of projects that I mentioned we're tracking globally, we have seen a shift away from enhanced oil recovery and enhanced hydrocarbon recovery to pure, for the sake of climate change mitigation, geologic storage and in saline reservoirs. We see that trend continuing. The majority of the new projects that we see are not enhanced recovery projects. They are trending toward the durable geologic storage for the sake of climate change mitigation. We expect that trend to continue. That is policy driven to a large extent, and it's those policies that make that business model investable. But absolutely, that's a trend we see. Having said that, for some of these first mover projects, especially in countries that have, tremendous needs for energy, demand and energy demand growth, it is interesting of what is the appropriate role in the front end for some of those enhanced recovery projects to help build that initial infrastructure you need, that CO2 pipeline network, that infrastructure required to connect all of these dots. That's an interesting conversation. But absolutely, bottom line, we do see a trend toward durable geologic storage for the sake of climate mitigation broadly and globally.
Wonderful. From David Below here, what are you seeing for opportunities for Native American tribes with a large number of orphan wells that may be leaking significant amount of methane? Is there a path for tribes to develop a program to effectively monitor, mitigate, and measure the effectiveness of sequestration?
Yeah. So, I think there's two questions there. I think, anything that's the fugitive methane emission, that's absolutely something that we need to work on. There's policies and programs that are there and available. There's keen interest in, mitigating those emissions of methane because again, it's a potent global warming, emission gas. And there are technologies available, one to track and understand where those emissive leaks are, and then to fix that. So I think that's one part of the question. I think a second part, right, that's maybe commingled is there an opportunity to do carbon management, carbon capture and storage on tribal lands, and I think that opportunity exists as well. There's some projects where those conversations are occurring, and again, that's part of that all of the above. Where are the point sources? Where are there opportunities to do the storage? What's the system going to look like that allows that to be an investment, an investable business model to allow that system to be built, owned, and operated and have that emission reduction that we all want.
From Hongyang Ma, what is the role of utilization in the futures of CCUS?
Yeah, great question. So if you go back 20 years, the acronym CCS, carbon capture and storage, and then at some point the conversation said, well, you can use CO2 and maybe that enhances a business model. Utilization came up. There are some things where you can utilize the CO2. Historically, as we already talked about, enhanced recovery, enhanced oil recovery, enhanced hydrocarbon recovery was the largest utilization historically of CO2. But you can use CO2 and put it in higher carbon content durable building materials, right? Cement, concrete building blocks that have higher CO2. That market could scale and could be a utilization, business case in parallel to doing the geologic storage. So that's one example of utilization. You can use CO2 to build other things, and there are companies that are working to do that, alternative fuels and things of this nature, other commodities that use CO2. One of the things that you need to look at is, can that utilization scale to climate relative scale? There are some markets that can, there are some that can't. And so while it may be a good business model, may be investable for a few things, for me globally, if we're going to get CCS to scale to that sort of gigaton scale, the majority of that probably has to be the durable geologic storage. But absolutely, are there opportunities to do utilization in parallel? Yes. Is that more societally acceptable in some regions and jurisdictions? Yes. Could that enable business models and get some, capture projects up and running that we all could benefit from and learn from? Yes. So it's not an either or, it's sort of a yes and. But that's a good way to think about what's the appropriate role of utilization, in parallel to large amounts of durable geologic storage, which is where we need to get to that gigaton scale ultimately.
Well, we're just rolling through these questions.
Great.
Next one is from Trevor Tillman. Do you see a shift away from aiming solvents regionally due to the potential of hazardous waste?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So amines have been a chemical engineering reality for decades, right? It's probably the most well-established technology. We see a lot of the amine being improved in terms of their efficiency to capture CO2. In terms of overall technical efficiency, overall system cost efficiency. A while ago, there was an interest in emissions from amines, degradation products from amines. Nitrosamines is the one that was of main concern. This was flagged in the technical community, probably well over a decade ago. Our colleagues in the community in Norway had a leading role to do really, great analytic work in terms of what are those degradation products, what are those emissions, how would you moderate and mitigate those and reduce those down to nil. And so we have seen progress in there. We continue to see amine-based capture technologies be a large part of the technology of choice for combustion-based systems for coal and gas-fired power generation, for example. There's a number of progresses that have been made from just a very standard generic amine that's been around again for decades and decades to really tailored amines designed for large scale carbon capture. And people add a variety of other things in there, whether it's piperazine or AMP or other chemicals. But there's a couple of things that people want, right? They absolutely care about environmental health and safety and want to make sure that that we understand the chemistry, we understand the degradation products. There are no adverse emissions that we cannot engineer and control to mitigate. And so that is a chief concern. It's a very, very important question. But I think the engineering community says we understand that space now. Again, there's been a bunch of work done. It's all been done in peer-reviewed journal articles. It's out publicly available. And there's a number of projects that are still going forward with that technology, in addition to other projects going forward with other technologies, whether it's sorbents or membranes or even cryogenic-based approaches or chemical looping-based approaches. So the technical community believes there is a path forward. A number of these projects are proving that point, and a number of the project developers and the amine developers are priding themselves in the stability of their solvents as we go forward and learn. These solvents, we're seeing less degradation, more stability, which is a very good thing overall as well.
All right then. Well, I'm afraid that we're just about out of time and we don't have more time for questions, but
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Jarad, for taking the time to come all the way out here and to give this presentation to us. It was very insightful. For anyone who's interested and wants to learn more, you can access the full report on his website right there, and we'll have it linked in ours as well. A full recording of this will be available within the coming days. And thank you all again for attending. I hope you have a good day and take care.